There is something unreal about the Sanskrit phrase Vasudeva Kutumbakam. It quite literally means the earth is one family. It's a concept of Lala land. Because in practice and reality, there is no such reality as the earth is one family. For all the wonderful declarations of United Nations and its innumerable world conferences on climate change, poverty, equality, war prevention, etc., when it comes to the crunch, it's every nation for itself. Or at the most, groupings of nations with vested interests, euphemistically called allies, band together to realize a common interest or meet a threat. And in that category also, contradictions spring up. Take, for example, the united front of Europe and America against Russia in the Ukraine war. That unity is now fraying at the seams because European nations are upset with America for its US Inflation Reduction Act, which could mean that supply chains move from Europe to America. Remember also, at the height of the COVID pandemic, besides India, no nation, and certainly not the developed world, shared its vaccine technology or even supply with other countries, especially the most vulnerable. It was like the jungle law, every nation for itself. The UN and WHO were left wringing their hands and making flatulent statements. In the light of these developments, the real issue of India acquiring the G20 presidency for 1 year by itself, an important and prestigious event, is not whether the conference will be used by the BJP to enhance its electoral prospects. That is honestly a laughable issue, a red herring. The real issue is whether India is sleepwalking into a trap for all kinds of pressures and blackmail that might be foisted on it at the time of the G20 summit next year. I will debate this vexed question, but first, a warm welcome to all viewers of the CAA show. CAA, as all of you know, is Conversations and Analysis, and my name is Juggi Bhasin. To watch this video podcast, press the big red subscriber button on your screen, and subscription is, of course, completely free. Now, why have I used the words blackmail and unwarranted pressures? The reason for that is that even though India has weathered the post-COVID economic shocks well and has emerged as the world's fifth largest economy, not many countries are inclined to give India its place in the sun. There is understated hostility and envy against India in many quarters of the world. There is also unleashed irritation against India that it marches to its own drumbeat and does not listen to anyone, certainly not the traditional big players on the world scene. Most of these entities are also aware of a major fault line that runs through the present government in Delhi. They are perfectly aware that despite India's newfound self-confidence on the world stage and the motivating pronouncements of our Foreign Minister Jaishankar in different fora, India remains vulnerable to its age-old problem. And that is that it is constantly seeking validation from the developed world, especially Europe and America, for the progress it is making, a kind of a pat on the back and pronouncements of good job done. The West knows of this fault line perfectly well. How and why they will use it is the question to be asked. On some key critical parameters, the West is dissatisfied with India. The West quite simply does not like India's Russia policy and its strategic detachment from the Ukraine conflict. It has been muted in its criticism of this issue so far, but make no mistake about it. It is deeply offended that why India is not severing its age-old relationship with Russia and putting all its eggs in the West basket. It would also like a more masculine engagement by India in the Asia-Pacific region and in Quad to counterbalance China so the interests of the West in this critical region can be protected. Secondly, since most Western governments presently are liberal woke oriented, they're not quite comfortable with the government in Delhi pursuing a no-nonsense policy on so-called minority appeasement and the tightening space given for religious conversion. And lastly, the West is not quite comfortable with the Atmanirbhar policy of the Modi government. This policy in the long run will squeeze, if not dry up, arms exports from the West and so many goods and services from other sectors. And lastly, and the most obvious current problem for the West is that it has been unable to block energy supplies from Russia to India, which is fast emerging as a big factor in the Ukraine conflict, a key factor some feel in emboldening Russia to continue waging war in Ukraine. India, on its part, rightfully eyes the G20 presidency as an opportunity to raise its profile, expand its tourism potential, and pitch India as a go-to place for huge investments and establishing supply chains. But it's a quid pro quo game for the West. Give us that and we will oblige. And we are not obliging in the traditional sense. And believe me, if not now, the pushback from the West and vested interests at home aligned with the West will come for sure. It could be in the form of a boycott on the eve of the summit by a Western power. It could be a move for strictures or even a call for sanctions against India in the United Nations on a human rights issue, for instance, say on Kashmir, or the freedom of the press, or on the minorities issue. And I bet that around the eve of the summit next year, Asian provocators in India will launch an agitation in India. They would like nothing better than to embarrass India in front of the international press and ensure that the reporting is all about the agitation and has nothing to do with the actual summit. Those who are to create trouble for India will certainly be from the opposition space, but to give covering fire, the real agitation will be led by groups and interests inimically hostile to India. Remember the Delhi riots around Trump's visit to Delhi. Something similar on those lines could unfold. India, on its part, could do well to be enthusiastic about the summit, but keep its expectations and hopes and even aspirations of the summit under check and manageable and realistic. We live in a fractured world with multiple interests and multiple players. The concept of one earth and one family is a bureaucratic catchline popular in esoteric circles like the United Nations. It's a dog-eat-dog, a cruel, pitiless world out there, each one for themselves. We would do well to remember that. And so on this note, I come to the end of this episode of the CAA Show. I hope you really enjoyed this particular episode. You like our show? Do subscribe to us. And on this note, it's goodbye and cheers from my end.